Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
And this is image of audition phonation as it illustrates the model of the communication model that Ferdinand de Saussure has discussed. So, as we see in the diagram here, this model that we have just spoken about, Ferdinand de Saussure's model, is illustrated by this diagram. So, see A as in person A is speaking, person B is hearing, he is hearing things, person B is hearing things, what A is saying, comprehending it. If you see, there is a small dotted line in the diagram. See closely, let us zoom into person B, you will see a dotted line from the ear, person B's ear to his kind of skull or brain. So, the idea being he is comprehending what has been spoken to her, he is making sense of it, she is making sense of it, and then speaking. So, that is audition, and again it goes to person A who hears it, comprehends it and then makes response to it. So, it is kind of a circuit, and the diagram below, concept and sound system, C for concept, H for sound system. So, as you see here, so this is a circuitry here, like audition and phonation occurs as if in a circuit. So, this is in some illustrating communication model by Ferdinand de Saussure. So, that being said, we will come in a moment to the loophole of the model. So, what in communication systems that Saussure's model could not account for. So, what, like, given the intricacies of the model and given the model was a radically new formulation at the time Saussure formulated it. That being said, Saussure's formulation only accounts for interpersonal linguistic verbal transmission. If we go back to the image of this audition and phonation, so one would realize the Saussure is saying is true, is applicable only for interpersonal communication. It cannot be true for example in a group discussion or in how print media is working or modern day examples. So, how for example Facebook operates, like this model is only accountable for interpersonal communication, and that too in the field of linguistic and verbal transmission. So, this is a shortcoming of Ferdinand de Saussure's model, in the sense that it could not make sense or account for other types of communication, extra linguistic communication or multipersonal communication. This is one drawback of the model. So, his speech circuit model, recall the diagram that we just saw, his speech circuit model, recall the diagram here, represents a closed circuit. As I said, that was a kind of a circuit. So, it goes from person A to person B, from B to A and so on and so forth. It is a loop. So, it is a closed circuit and discounts the role of what mediates the communication, that is to say the codes and the social contexts involved in communication. Say for example, if I ask someone, would you like to go out for a movie tonight, and she says that, well, I have an exam tomorrow. So, well, I could make sense of that this person is saying no, although not explicitly, but I would take whenever the other person says that I have an exam tomorrow, I will take that as a no. In other words, what I am suggesting is, so this is the context of the specific communication that renders meaning to what somebody is saying. Although the person before me is not explicitly saying no, she is saying that I have an exam tomorrow, but that in that specific context, in the specific situation would be interpreted as a no. So, this is another shortcoming of Saussure's model. It does not take into account. So, as I said, that it is a closed circuit, so much so that it does not take into account the processes of mediation and the specificities of context that plays out during the communication system. Or also imagine the kind of poetic language, literary devices, metaphors, and so on and so forth. So, if someone says I love you from moon to back, of course, moon is an expression here which is used metaphorically, and that has to be interpreted in with reference to a particular context. So, imagine phrasal verbs, imagine literary expressions, imagine poetic expressions, poetic language, metaphoric languages, and so on and so forth. So, for metaphors we intend to convey beyond what literally the words mean. As I gave you the example, if someone loves someone from moon to back, moon does not literally mean moon here. So, it is a metaphor, it is an expression, it is a metaphoric expression which amounts to some kind of measuring unit rather than the literal moon out there. So, this is something, this is the context specificity of communication systems, which a closed circuit model like Ferdinand de Saussure's could not account for. What we are trying to suggest here that it is therefore often the social contexts that give new meanings and new tinges to what has been intended to communicate. So, realizing this in 1960, Roman Jakobson is an American Russian linguist, and his dates are 1896 to 1982. So, in 1960, realizing this drawbacks, Roman Jakobson proposes a new model of interpersonal communication. So, this is interpersonal communication nevertheless, but it is a kind of an extrapolation of Saussure's model. So, he draws on Saussure's model and tries to explain and account for the context specificities. This model takes care of the lacuna in the Saussurean model. So, while stressing on the impact of social contexts, as we have been saying, like the drawback in Saussure's model, Jakobson invokes 6 factors. These are So, these are the 6 factors that impacts communication. So, Roman Jakobson invokes these 6 factors that he believes impacts our communication system and verbal communication to be precise. And now, if you juxtapose this with the model that we just discussed, Ferdinand de Saussure's model, you would realize Ferdinand de Saussure's model only involved addresser and the addressee, and this duo, the addresser and the addressee, was bound, relationally bound in a closed circuitry. So, this is, as you realize, is the innovation that Jakobson is making. This is the extrapolation. So, he invokes these 6 factors here. So, Jakobson writes, and I will read it out from his book: the addresser sends a message to the addressee. To be operative, the message requires a context referred to, which is the referent, in other words, somewhat ambivalent nomenclature. This is Jakobson's own words, seizable by the addressee and either verbal or capable of being verbalized, a code fully or at least partially common to the addresser and addressee, in other words, to the encoder and the decoder of the message, and finally, a contact, a physical channel and psychological connection between the addresser and the addressee, enabling both of them to stay in communication. So, as I said, like in the case of the example that I gave you, that when someone says, well, I have an exam tomorrow, this answer, this response conveys implicitly, this response conveys no when asked whether someone would go to a movie. This is an implicit no, this conveys an implicit no, and this has to be interpreted with reference to the context, to be precise, and no is the message, and the context, that the exam is happening tomorrow and so on and so forth. This is the context, and the contact, like, and the contact, as Jacobson said, like the physical contact, like the physical medium through which communication happens. You could imagine this in terms of the cell phone, the computer, and so on. So, these are technological infrastructures through which the communication happens. That is what Jacobson calls like the contact, and the code, like codifications, like imagine again metaphorical languages. So, those are embedded with certain codes which has to be deciphered in a particular way, like from moon to back as an expression, like it is a code that renders the moon, like I am not saying the moon as in the moon out there, like the word moon, the expression moon in the phrasal verb, it is the code that renders the expression, the word moon with its metaphorical meaning. So, these are all Jacobson suggests are equally important, equally significant in the context of communication processes. So, as evident, Jacobson is not radically altering the basic premise of Saussure's model, but complementing it in a way, as I said, like he draws on there are certain features, as I said, 1, 2, like addresser, addressee, and the circuitry and so on. He does not dismiss Ferdinand de Saussure altogether, but he draws on Saussure's model and tries to extrapolate it, extend it, so that it may also account for other kind of communications, though still sticking to interpersonal communication. So, he is introducing the nuances of the social referential aspect on the top of lexical and linguistic aspect of communication. So, this is the radical difference between Saussure and Jacobson. So, Jacobson's model extrapolating on the linguistic and lexical aspect of communication, which was the premise of Ferdinand de Saussure's model. So, as the image suggests here, if you see, addresser and addressee is in the either side of the image, and in between what we have is the channel, the message, and the code. So, the innovation upon Saussure's model is precisely what we see in the middle, in between the addresser and the addressee. Like in contrast with the Saussurean model, where the addresser and addressee was bound in the form of a closed circuit. This is not a circuit, so to say, but the message what the addresser is trying to pass on to the addressee moves on through this three different interface, like that of the channel, that of the message, and that of the code. So, there is this interface, there is this interstitial space, so to say, that Jacobson's model invokes, and in trying to do so, he takes care of the social referential aspect of communication. However, having said that, I would say Jacobson's model, like Saussure's, as I said, only explains interpersonal communication and is unidirectional, in the sense that the message always flows from addresser to addressee. Imagine, like in Saussure's model also, addresser and addressee was linked in a circuit, though not in a circuit. In the context of Jacobson's model, message is still flowing from addresser to the addressee and vice versa, though through a set of interfaces. But now, if you juxtapose this with Wikipedia, say for example, as a media platform, so it is not that the content or the message always flows from the addresser to the addressee. As I have been reiterating right from the onset, the Wikipedia as a platform lets us edit its contents, we can make comments, we can delete and make revisions and so on and so forth. So, this is not the Wikipedia is in a sense not unidirectional. The kind of communication that unfolds over Wikipedia, as Wikipedia is just an example, and when I say Wikipedia, I mean the digital medium as such, like the social media and the digital media and so on and so forth. So, it is not that message or content in the case of social media, in the case of it is not that message in the context of new media necessarily flow from addresser to the addressee. It could be it's a lot more interactivity. This is yet another this is one of the characteristics that we have ascribed to the new media. Like Saussure's model, Jacobson's model is also unidirectional in the sense that message always flows from the addresser to the addressee, from the producer to the consumer of the message. So, what we have learned so far in the context of the two models is that both the models are working on a fundamental, they are premised on a working principle, that is the assumption that there is a producer, there is a consumer, there is an addresser and there is an addressee. So, this is the dualistic nature of the communication models, the two communication models that we discussed, which is very different from the new media kind of communication, wherein I have been reiterating the line between the producer, consumer, addresser, addressee has been blurred. So, in other words, that demarcated boundary between the producer and the consumer is still retained in these two models. So, this in other words could not account for kinds of communication which is pervasive in the domain of new media. It could not account for that kind of communication systems. So, for this in 1999, fairly recently, Stuart Hall, and his dates are, as I mentioned, 1932 to 2014, he recently passed away. He furnishes a model in 1999. So, his model of encoding decoding, Stuart Hall's So, Stuart Hall formulates this model in 1999, this model of encoding decoding, what he calls radicalizes the two other models, the models that we discussed, at least on three different grounds. For the first time, his model explains, and will do a detailed discussion on the encoding decoding model, but let me tell you what was radically different, radically new in Stuart Hall's model, and how Stuart Hall's model characterizes the shift away from the passivity, from the addresser addressee, producer consumer dyadic understanding of communication systems to a more multipersonal, ideology oriented functioning of media platforms. So, Stuart Hall's model radicalizes communications at least on three different grounds. For the first time, his model explains mass communication as opposed to interpersonal communication. Like what we have been discussing so far is interpersonal communication, person to person, like one person conversing with another, as opposed to if you think of newspapers or the broadcast media or radio, television and so on and so forth, those are models of mass communication. So, now if we recall Saussure's model or Jacobson's, or if we recall Saussure's or Jacobson's model, these two models could not account for mass communication, which Stuart Hall's model would be able to do. Number two, it throws light on the question of political intent, ideology and the contexts involved in both producing and receiving media content. Like there is ideological aspect and there are dispositions, there are ideological inclinations to how certain media platforms impart, communicate, convey information. So, if we recall again the earlier two models, that did not take into that. What Jacobson's model did was to account for the context, Nevertheless, issues of ideology, issues of political dispositions and so on and so forth was not still addressed in the Jacobsonian model. Number 3, Stuart Hall's model questions the passivity of the addressee and the consumer. So, this is very important, this is something radically new, and this is something which could provide us an important gateway, provide us an important footing in understanding the dynamics of the new media. So, for the first time it questions the passivity of the receiver, the addressee or the consumer of media. Now, let us get into the details of the model. So, in as much as signs have multiple meanings, if we recall Saussure's model here, signs have multiple meanings in the sense that they have both signifier So, as we discussed, signs are constitutive of signifier and signified inasmuch as they yield denotative and connotative meanings. So, denotative meanings are literal meanings. If we go back to our moon example, if someone says I love you from moon to back. So, the moon, the literal meaning of the moon as in the moon out there, the astronomical imagination of the moon is its denotative meaning, that is the literal meaning, as opposed to the connotative meaning, where in the phrasal verb, where in the metaphorical expression the moon is an unit, the moon from the moon to back is a metaphorical expression of an unit of measurement is an. So, this is the connotative meaning. So, signs moon again, like if you imagine moon as a sign, is constitutive of denotative and connotative meanings. So, inasmuch as signs have multiple as in denotative and connotative meanings, the content of media is after all a part of the larger discourse of cultural production coded with multiple significations. So, what I mean by this is cultural productions and their reception are reflective of the ideological dispositions of those who produce and consume. Yeah, so, cultural productions and how those productions, those messages are received are reflective of the ideological dispositions of who encodes the content of the media and the ideological dispositions of those who produce and consume the media content. So, according to Stuart Hall, frameworks of knowledge, relations of production and technical infrastructure interfere in the process of how the content of media is rendered discursively meaningful from the point of views of both the producer and the consumer. So, I'll try to explain this. I mean, this is a very complex set of propositions being made by Stuart Hall. Yeah, to put simply, whosoever is coding the message, whosoever is producing the content of the media embeds their ideological dispositions, their political inclinations to the way they design and engineer the content of the media. So, what Stuart Hall is suggesting that whosoever produces the media content and whosoever consumes the media content, regardless of that, there are ideological and political dispositions that render the content meaningful, discursively meaningful. So, what Hall means by this is, yeah, at this point I would like to invoke another theorist called Emile Benveniste and his distinction between the concept of the discours and the histoa and discourse. Like in other words, these are French words that Emile Benveniste uses as concept, but then this roughly translates as history and discourse. So, in order to better understand this set of very complex proposition that Stuart Hall is making, we will draw on Emile Benveniste. So, Emile Benveniste's concept of the histo and discourse would be particularly relevant in understanding how Stuart Hall is rendering the content of the media discursively meaningful. So, I will get into the idea of the discourse, taking cues from Emile Benveniste. So, this is a distinction between histoa and discourse, roughly translated as history and discourse, that Emile Benveniste makes. So, imagine a statement, if I make a statement like India is in the northern hemisphere, apparently this is a fact and this has been validated by geographers, and any sane person whatsoever would barely contest to this, because this would be assumed as a statement, as a matter of fact, as factually validated statement that India is in the northern hemisphere. But this looks like this is, and since this is factual, this is apparently a factual statement being made, Emile Benveniste would club this within the category of histoa, as in this, there is an element of truth. There is a truth claim to the statement which is hardly contestable. In contrast, imagine a statement like, if we say so, in contrast to this statement, if I say I think India is in the northern hemisphere. So, this is just two words, I think. If we just add it before the statement that I made, India is in the northern hemisphere, and I think India is in the northern hemisphere, this makes a hell lot of difference. The statement immediately becomes subjective. So, it immediately falls short of the truth claim that it was apparently making. So, this is an example of what Emile Benveniste calls discourse. So, discourse, as the diagram here shows, is largely ideological and therefore subjective. But then all statements, even statements that are apparently factual and are, in other words, historically, could be historically validated, can also be read and interpreted as discourse. I mean, the example that I gave you, like India is in the northern hemisphere, is a fact, is a matter of fact, is a statement. If you imagine, like, there is no north and south of a circular thing that the globe is, there is no east and west of a circular thing that the globe is. So, but then one could reflect on, one could ask that which is the reference point based on which the north and the south and the east and west have been coordinated the way they appear to be as true. Like, there is a particular ideological aspect to the cartographic imagination of why India is in the north and Africa is in the south, and so is in the east, and so in the west. So, this is a particular cartographic imagination that caters to the interest of a particular ideology. We are not wanting to go to the details of this, but as you realize, for a globe, for a circular entity like the globe, this kind of a certain cartographic imagination has been engineered with the reference point with Europe as its center. So, it is a particular ideological orientation of the cartographic imagination of the globe, particular imagination of the space. If we are going to decode this ideological and political underpinnings of statements which are otherwise perceived to be true, historically validated, and so on and so forth, there is a discourse to it, there is a subjective ideological underpinning to it. So, in thinking in these terms, all statements, all facts, even scholars and historians, like people who are into science and technology studies nowadays, even argue that scientific statements are also largely ideological and subjective. So, what we see in the lab, what goes on, what passes off as scientifically true, scientifically validated statements, are also observations that are observed in lab by a human subject, and so on and so forth. I see certain things and I write my lab report in a particular way, so that it becomes so called apparently perceived objective scientific report. So, in a sense, this whole claim to objectivity, claim to truth, claim to historicity, and so on and so forth precedes the observation, precedes the interpretation, precedes the cognitive faculty of a human subject, and this is what renders even historical truth, factually verified truth claims as subjective and largely ideological, and that is what we call is discursive. So, Stuart Hall, in propounding the model that we are discussing now, let us get back to Stuart Hall from Benveniste. So, in formulating the model, Stuart Hall is interested in the questions of discourse, to be precise, how certain media communications, how certain media platforms, how certain communication processes are politically tinged, ideologically tinged, and discursively engineered. So, Stuart Hall is interested in this kind of questions. So, as you see in the diagram, Stuart Hall invokes three aspects of communication: encoding, decoding, and recoding. And as we realize, Stuart Hall's model is called the encoding decoding model, and this again, as you see, is kind of a very complex circuit that Stuart Hall is talking about. What he means by encoding is the creation of the text, as in the content, to be precise, with specific messages, like we embed certain message within what within what we want to broadcast, what we want to circulate, and so on and so forth. So, this is what Stuart Hall calls encoding, the embedding of information, the embedding of truth claims, the embedding of certain texts in the messages of communication. This, when goes to the receiver, the addressed, is decoded. So, this is the perception, this is the individual perception, this is the subjective perception, this is the interpretation of the messages that one receives. And it is worth noting here is the ideological tinge with which a message is embedded might not be decoded in the same fashion it has been encoded. So, this is very important in the context of the Stuart Hall's model. So, encoding and decoding could also be two spectrums of a very different political ideological orientations. So, once it is decoded, it is appropriated, like there are certain set of ideology, there are certain set of discursive meanings that we derive and we decode out of the content of the media, and those ideology again in turn recycles when we recode our message. Like when we receive a message, there is a code that we decode when we receive, and that is recycled, that ideological underpinning. This encoding. So, in sum, what Stuart Hall is suggesting, that we encode the message with a particular set of ideological assumptions. So, when the addresser or the consumption of message decodes it, he or she decodes it with another set of ideological dispositions, and in cycle this set of ideological dispositions are again recycled when we recode the message to retransfer it. So, this is again like a circuit, but what is important in the context of Stuart Hall's model is like the set of ideological underpinnings. So, now ideologies are a set of social constructs that are made to appear natural. So, ideologies reflect, and I will quote Terry Eagleton here. Terry Eagleton says that ideologies reflect the partisan perspective of a social group or class, which then mistakes itself as universal and eternal. So, what he means by this is ideologies are a set of values, a set of shared value system that protects, that serves and caters to the ideological interest of a certain class of people, certain group of people, a certain set of people, and so on and so forth, which are then passed off as blanket statements that are made to appear natural. Yeah, so the media, among others, like, is one such apparatus through which a set of ideological discourses are proliferated. Like, think for example, the Hindi news that would be broadcast in Doordarshan in the 1980s. Now, television scholars have written about this, how the Hindi news, like if we recall in the 1980s, there would be news in 3 different languages: Hindi, English, and depending on the Doordarshan channel, local channel, there would be news in the vernacular. So, television scholars have written on how the Hindi news broadcast in the 1980s would function as a springboard of the linguistic nationalism that era was so fervent with. So, as you realize, the media, among other things, are used and often abused to a great extent as springboards for proliferating certain ideological aspirations and ideological interests. I will give you an example. So, what you see on screen is a tweet by the US President Donald Trump, who happens to accuse CNN, the news corporation CNN, to be broadcasting fake news, and in doing so, President Trump accused that the CNN isn't serving the interest of the US. It is not representing the US, not representing true US. So, in a way he was accusing, as you see on screen, Trump is accusing CNN of broadcasting fake news. So, in a response tweet, CNN came up with a very sharp retort. What the CNN says, you see on screen, CNN says it is not CNN's job to represent the US to the world, that is yours. Our job is to report the news. So, what these 2 tweets, if we reflect on this, if we look into these 2 tweets very carefully, there is a set of ideological aspiration from the President Trump himself, that is certain ideological aspirations that he envisages CNN to fulfill, to comply to, which you realize that the CNN is not obliging to. Imagine the 9/11 incident, the September 11 incident, the Afghan wars for example, or the Iraq war. The way this would be reported in the CNN IBN would not be similarly reported in the Fox News or Al Jazeera. So, it is the same piece of news, it is the same incident, it is the same event, but like the way, for example, the 3 news channels that I have mentioned, Fox News, Al Jazeera TV and CNN IBN would have reported it, would be fundamentally different. So, what makes, although it is same event, what makes the reporting, the broadcast of the news different is the ideological orientation, the political inclination, and so on and so forth. So, this is what Stuart Hall is concerned with, the ideological underpinnings of how media broadcast, media infrastructures are laden with. So, notwithstanding the factuality of the news piece, as in these are facts, the 9/11 as an event was a fact, is an event, is a fact, the Afghan war was a fact, the Iraq war was a fact. So, we are not trying to question the factuality of the event. So, notwithstanding the factuality, each of these channels, needless to mention, represents different political views, different ideological affiliations and contentious stakes, and which is why the tweet, the 2 tweets that we just now visited, Donald Trump's and CNN's, is illustrative of the contention, is illustrative of the different, the disparity in the ideological expectations. So, this is implicit in how rather than what is being broadcasted. So, the Stuart Hall model, what we just saw, is more interested in probing into how things are broadcasted rather than what is broadcasted. So, a raw historical event, Stuart Hall writes, and I am going to read this quotation, a raw historical event cannot in that form be transmitted by, say, a television newscast. Events can only be signified within the oral, visual forms of the televisual discourse. In the moment when a historical event passes under the sign of discourse, it is subject to the complex formal rules by which language signifies. To put it paradoxically, recall the Hindi news in this context. So, it is the language, it is a linguistic reinforcement that comes to play when the Doordarshan was broadcasting the news in Hindi. So, this, which is why Stuart Hall says it is subject to all the complex formal rules by which language signifies. Back to the quotation, to put it paradoxically, the event must become a story. I mean, this is a refrain, story. The story is a refrain that often appears in our thinking about the media. Somebody is doing a story, the CNN is doing a story, the ABP is doing a story. So, as you realize, stories are engineered, stories are conceived, stories are construed, like people make stories. Stories are not historical, like people conceive stories before they are represented. So, Stuart Hall says, to put paradoxically, the event must become a story. So, it is no longer the event, it is no longer the incident, it is no longer the factually verified incident that the news, that the media house or the broadcasting corporation is is telecasting or broadcasting. It is the story, it is necessarily a story that is being represented. So, it must become a story before it can become a communicative event. In that moment, the formal sub rules of discourse are in dominance, without of course subordinating out of existence the historical event so signified. So, it is not the historical event that the news corporation is broadcasting. So, it is the signification, and you recall Ferdinand Saussure here. So, it is the signification, it is a particular ideological underpinning of the signification that the media houses are representing. The social relations in which the rules are set to work, or the social and political consequences of the event having been signified in this way. So, that is what Hall calls encoding. So, it is, as I said, news houses, broadcasting corporations no longer work with facts, no longer work with historical events. It is not the event when we switch on our television, it is not the it is not just the historical incident that unfolds before us. It is a set of ideological underpinnings depending on who did the story that is put forth before us. So, this is what Stuart Hall means by encoding. This, however, does not guarantee that the audience, recipients or the addressees would decode the content of the media with the same intent, same political intent that it has been encoded with. And with this, since there is a disparity in the way news story could be encoded and the way it could be decoded, Stuart Hall talks about three disjunctive ways in which we could read text, and for that matter a news content as a text.